So, good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. For those who are following us from Spain, which I've seen a few friends in my family. So, thank you first to Mr. Mohammed and to ArchiNet for having me tonight. I think it's a big opportunity, not only for me, but also I recommend you to follow most of the lectures that they are proposing and the guests that they are inviting. They are really interesting, and I think it's an excellent way in these times to foster, and bridge the gap and connect us better, which is the goal of all of us as a society. So thank you, Mr. Mohammed. I'm very, very happy, and that I postponed this opportunity for weeks until I finish some commitments that I had. And also thank you to my students. Some of them, most of them, I've seen them after a very long journey day that we have had today. So thank you for being here. So I'm going to be talking today. The title was Modern Contemporary Architecture from the Misunderstanding of the International Style to our Architectural Agenda, because I want to talk about two things. One is modern architecture, which we know as historian of architecture that it's something framed in the first half of the 21st century. And then I want to bridge this gap with the contemporariness, because I really believe, that's why I quote in this brief summary, that we're still, of course, learning, and we're in a period which is connecting us with modern architecture and postmodernism or high-tech, or call it parameterization. These are all small, shorter episodes of a larger thing, which is modernity and modern architecture. This is my belief, not only mine, and maybe it's very important that we can call quote Jürgen Habermas and other people. But for that, I will try to explain briefly. I cannot promise, but I will try to make it short. A part of my thesis, which is the crisis of modern architecture in the debates of European magazines of the 50s and its repercussion in the United States of America, or the magazines, And then I will try to connect that with a couple of building up on not something that I came up with, but building up on a professor, science professor that I really think that is really worthy to read, whose name is Juan Antonio Cortés. He teaches in the University of Valladolid, and he has this opuscule or small book which is called Inconsistency. It's not translated into English, or it's more consistency and inconsistency. Formal and material strategies in the architecture of the last decade of the 20th century. And also this, luckily translated to English, a short essay of 15 pages called Strong Force, in which he extends his reflection and his thoughts on the last decade into the first decade of the 21st century. These have been published by this magazine, which probably you all know, which is El Crow. I'm doing that just to propose, this is my goal. I don't want to make this a solipsistic discussion with myself. I would like, if possible, that afterwards we have a conversation, and truly conversation, a real conversation with other people. This is what we are all aiming for in this series, I guess. And for that, I'm throwing some ideas. Some of them belong to, like I said, my investigation, and some of them I'm taking them almost literally from Juan Antonio. For example, in his book, New Consistency, he was proposing, based on another writer, the Italian writer Italo Calvino, he was making this parallelism with ideas taken from literature and a series of lectures that Italo Calvino was giving, except for the last one, in the United States of America. And he was saying that there is Juan Antonio Cortés was saying there is a parallelism with writing in modern contemporary architecture. So we can say that this left column, in which we have these concepts like lightness, rapidity, or expressive economy, exactitude or accuracy, perceptibility, or multiple types of perceptible. These are characteristics of modern and contemporary architecture. And probably, if we compare that with the historical, with the classical architecture, we are lacking of the consistency. This is the idea behind the theory, behind books. We are lacking of this consistency that, of course, classical architecture has, because buildings are relying on solidness, on bearing walls, on massiveness, and we are looking for lighter buildings and other issues that are taking us to buildings that probably have a lack of consistency. So, how to achieve this new consistency is the goal of the book. And he explains that we can do that through formal and material strategy that he explains in different ways, being them, yeah, some of them related to how we plan, taking examples of Brutalism, for example, and material studies, how we use glass or how we use different materials, the way that instead of being really light, we will see one example, they become solid or consistent, again. In the second part of the, the title of the book is, I think, this article of in which he's praising or he's sustaining that a contemporary architecture will be looking or is trying to, in a way, the statement is, okay, we have a lot of blob, weak forms, but actually they don't have a cultural impact in many ways because they rely so much on the process rather on the output of the outcome, which is what society is perceiving, not our internal discussions and processes as architects, but actually what we give to the society and we add to the to the city or to the urban or to the landscape context. So he's saying that in order to achieve this idea before of new consistency, now of strong forms that can be cultural, meaningful to the society, we can do that, and he will, and I will present a few examples through strategies that are pairing two concepts, being them integration and differences, unitary form and deformation, structural enclosure, continuity plus differential variation, golden escape, light color, transparency, and reflection. But that will be in the second part. Except in this first one, sorry, I will rely more on explaining what I found in my research related to the architecture of the 50s. This is an Excel sheet that I worked with, in which I studied a number of magazines of Europe and United States of America throughout the decade of the 50s, reaching 1960, in which I was highlighting what articles and what themes were more important, and then I placed a structure in which I found this in Spanish, but of course I translated some of the main topics for you in English, in which I saw that in the magazines in Europe, these were the main topics that were subject of debate at that time, in the English spectrex, neo-liberty, etc. I will be going through them, not in depth, because I want to leave some time for the second part and for the discussion, but just a bit, or at least outlining them. No, I mean, these themes are just the topics, but actually what they are talking or discussing are key things like the role of history in modern architecture, or how the tradition can inform it, what's the role of technique, how can we achieve, again, a new monumentality, if architecture is the synthesis of arts, etc. All these things that we know that, in my opinion, they are still part of the debate or our agenda, our contemporary agenda to some extent. Assuming I'm not repeating what I said until now, so I continue. The first debate I'm saying, and that's why the title of the lecture is From the Misunderstanding of International Style, actually is this, because I think that these highlighted articles in the magazines are taking us back to the international international exhibition in 1932 in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, in which Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock were presenting this exhibition, in which they were trying to have a balance between European and American architecture. The way that, in a way, what they were doing, we know, is validate the architecture of the European modern movement of the 20s and 30s, I would say, in a way that, say, removing the cultural component or the sociological component, we have a more stylistic and more, or an easier architecture to be digested by the American public in a way. This was the idea, and this is a strategy that goes through the whole decade. The American magazines and also some writers and authors, they will be always pairing architecture from Europe with, of course, the genius of Frank Lloyd Wright, but other architects and other proposals that they are throwing as American. The way that they rely on the value of kind of the neo-antiquity, which is the modern movement of the European architecture of the 20s and 30s, and they say, okay, we are doing this, but also look to what we can do. This will be the strategy, and actually it is based on this, of course, examples that we know, the Ode, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, the Ville-Savoie, so these buildings that actually were, the main problem, I would say, is that Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock were placing a very simplistic vision of the architectural scenario, panoramic in Europe, and they were reducing it to, well, a number of simple rules that probably were, we are having buildings that are lighter because we have volume instead of mass, and then we have regularity instead of axial symmetry, and this articulation of these volumes. And of course, we have absence of arbitrary applied decoration, with this very smooth white planes of the buildings with the ribbon windows or fenêtre longue in the words of Le Corbusier. Then the first debate in the 50s will be this one, the international style 20 years after, in which Henry Russell Hitchcock, who was one of the curators of the exhibition, was criticizing himself, and saying, we did something wrong. No, we were very rigid. We weren't able to see how varied the scene in Europe and actually also in America at the same time was at that time. And then the criticism was extended, and there are many articles of this period of the beginning of the 50s by people like Eero Saarinen or Richard Neutra, Robert Woods Kennedys, Walter Gropius. This is even Philip Johnson later talking in Harvard, and at the bottom, well, so many people saying, okay, what's international style? Why there is this confusion with modern architecture or European architecture? And where are we moving forward? This is where James Moss Richards is asking in this article, the next step from there. What happens is that the books of the 50s and 60s, and even this one, Philip Drew, third generation in the 70s, they were not very comfortable and happy with the definition of international style. Some of them ignored explicitly talking about the exhibition, and even later, although Charles Jenks is paying some attention in this diagram in the 70s, that he continues at the end of the 20th century, sorry, and even later, some of the books, some of the most important histories of architecture, like this of Kenneth Frampton, they are helping to this misunderstanding. Even Bruno Sevi towards an organic architecture, they are not being very accurate when they are something that we know, defining what's modern architecture, what's modern movement, what is international style. They are moving the dates, they are extending, like in the case of Kenneth Frampton, from buildings that were not even part of the international exhibition, like this one of Rudolf Schindler, to periods that will end later, like the Brutalism or even the postmodernism in the middle of the decade of the 60s. William Curtis Alan Colquhoun explicitly will say, I don't mind avant-garde, modern movement, modern architecture. To me, is the same. No, I will use these words indifferently. And then that's why I'm saying that we start from this misunderstanding of the international style that I truly believe that here in, after having been here in Saudi Arabia or the Middle East for 6 years, this is my 7th, that this is standard, This is the standard that we are understanding or accepting as, okay, this is modern architecture. Volumes, very simple volumes, geometric, flat roof, horizontal windows, white surfaces, etc. Of course, there's been attempts of Jan Ricohen, William Curtis, of extending this narrow view of history to something more inclusive, with examples from Latin America, even from Africa and from Asia. But so far, this is where we have this debate between Europe and America, which is not including other views and other architectures from different parts of our planet. Then going back to the debates on what was happening in the decade of the 50s, one of the main debates will be the one of the picturesque that I'm passing very fast, the different articles that this takes place in the pages of the Architectural Review, this magazine in which Gordon Cullen, Nicholas Spessner, and they are discussing how the cities can be more beautiful, this is it, can be less ugly, the new towns, by incorporating or adding some of the strategies that this English style of the 16th century, it was kind of a revival in somehow, in a way. So how can this be connected to what they were doing in urban planning in a way? Of course, Nicholas Spessner is championing for that, And there will be an interesting debate with Alan Colquhoun, because whereas Pevsner is thinking that the picturesque is connected in a way with some examples of the architecture of the modern movement, Alan Colquhoun, who was very young at the time, is saying that this is absolutely crazy. The impact of the picturesque debate in America is very limited, and I would say framed or just taken to the aspect of how we see streets and avenues. You know, and there's some people like Paul Rudolph, Martin Nowitzki, even Vincent Scully later, that are taking part on that. At the same time as this debate of the picturesque, another beautiful debate in the English magazines will be that of the brutalism that was not very successful at the beginning until the Smithsons, they published this, which was the first work of the first brutalist work, if we want, in England, a school of at Hunstanton. And then even Rainer Banham, who was very supportive of the brutalism at that time, added some confusion, no, by linking this with Le Corbusier, Ronchamp, like we see in that image. So it wasn't very successful. So it wasn't, let's say, like more successful than the picturesque. Actually, it's not until it moves to America, to the United States of America, with this very same pictures that they are using in American Architectural Forum magazine, the same picture as in Architectural Review, when this will have an echo, it will have a larger, broader impact, I would say. And then in the words of Joan Ockman, of course, we have this school of brutalism in American, not only because there is a proper kind of a style, no, if you allow me to use this word, because it's a word that was banned by the and Rainer Banham. They didn't want the brutalism to was a style, but something like an ethic, no, a signal of aesthetics. But it's true that some, I mean, the number of buildings, the heritage, you know, the legacy of buildings that we have now in the United States of America and also in the east of Europe, for example, I can, let's say, assure that it was very successful how this was spread to many places in the world, more than England. Now that will be like the third debate, no? We move from international style, picturesque brutalism. Then at the same time, in 1957 and 1958, we have two important exhibitions, one in Brussels, in which architecture is dealing with other important issues, I would say. For example, what is, again, the role of decoration that we will call now ornament. What is how we do, or how we can move from decoration to this honesty of materials? No? That's something that is very still an element that is part of our contemporary agenda, taking that from the brutalism, for example. How to make the construction visible, still this preference of the geometric forms, etc. So, but more important than that is that, of course, in Brussels, 58, sorry, we have a lot of individual buildings that are disconnected. No, they're not talking as a city. There's no such thing as a urban planning that is linking. This is a huge criticism. I know, because when we were moving from the Siam times of discussing the city in depth, and then we find that these structures or buildings are disconnected completely. This is a huge criticism that the planning of the exhibition will receive, but also the boldness or the audacity of the structures. No, this blurred boundary between architecture and engineering, which is very clear. For example, in the French pavilions, will lead some architects to monstrosities like this one. No, like of course, there is this background or this backdrop of the Cold War after World War II, in which American and the East Bloc of Yugoslavia, Poland, the Soviet republics, they are competing, no, to see which building is better and is representing better the achievements of their country. And for that, they take, again, almost literally ideas from the international style in terms of the lightness of the buildings, the transparency, etc. But others, well, we will, like in the case of the Spanish pavilion, we will be more interested in a more kind of technological approach in the sense of a rational structure. Although there's this struggle, which is very important in throughout the decade, no? Of, for example, how modern is the building itself, you know, the Spanish pavilion, and well, the folklore and the content that we are showcasing in this pavilion, which of course the umbrellas are resembling this franchise rights building of a few years before. No? This is the Philip Pavilion by Le Corbusier in this collaboration with Yanis Xenakis, the architect and musician. Again, something very technological, I would say. In the American magazines, it will be received like a festival of abstraction, no, something to enjoy. Not only because the pavilion, the American pavilion, was very successful, the one built by Edward Stone, but also because they really see that there is some optimism, and they embrace this idea of architecture linked to industry, which is key for the development of the modern architecture and actually for for the success of architecture in the 50s and the 60s, the way that architects are working along with industry, and also magazines are embracing this joyful marriage, let's say. Like that, yeah, in Europe, we have this other, another exhibition, which is in Berlin, that is less interesting for the Americans because it is dealing with multifamilial, no, these housing blocks that probably, no, if we look at an individual society, as it is the American one, has less interest, although there was some interesting buildings, of course, by architects like Gropius, Niemeyer, and Le Corbusier. We have seen some examples here. They are not adding too much, they would say, and then they skip it in the American publications. Champ, I would say, is the most important event when it comes to the decade of the 50s in the European magazines, and of course, it will have an important echo in the American magazines because this is a building that cannot be classified easily. It's so shocking, no? Even for people like Ernesto Nazan Rogers, although of course he will write in favor accepting this as a work of a genius, Le Corbusier, a masterpiece, the synthesis of art, etc. There are other, even James Stirling will have some problems, some doubts about that. So it's not as we are receiving or reading that, Ronchamp nowadays in any history of architecture, in which we will never find a single history of architecture in which Ronchamp is not one of the key central pieces, one of the three masterpieces of modern architecture. It was received with some criticism in Europe, even by Bruno Servi, although he will change his mind later. But in America, they will be more generous, writing about this. I think Giulio Carlo Allegan, for example, will write against Le Corbusier and another Italian architect would say that this work is not fitting in. It's very dishonest with modern architecture and with the former career of Le Corbusier as a functionalist, as someone believing in the rational architecture, etc. Well, all these problems that we are seeing that we have in Europe about how to use history and how to use technology, how they come hand in hand. In America, they don't have this problem. Even Perspecta, the magazine, magazine of the Yale University, since the Yale University was trying to incorporate history in his academic and in their curriculum for teaching history, they will use Perspecta as a vehicle for showing, well, how the masters of modern architecture, when you write Le Corbusier, they were having issues, or they were having, at the time that Le Corbusier was not even calling himself Le Corbusier, but Charles-Edouard Jeanneret, or Frank writes in this competition, in which he has a very classical facade. So they're saying, no, it's okay, history is okay, we accept it, and we can build upon this, and that with other things that will lead probably to issues that will take us to postmodernism. Eero Saarinen will have the chance to propose a synthesis of these ideas, because in the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they will offer him to build a few buildings in the campus, the Kresge Auditorium and the chapel, and he's proposing a very technological solution with this dome, which is touching the ground in 3 points only, and then the cylinder with the mystic light inside. That also, it's not happily received by everybody in the in the magazines. No, again, the Americans try to validate this by inviting James Richards, Bruno Sevi, people to talk about this building, and they say, okay, some of these things that he's proposing are okay, but we don't find that this synthesis is successful as a whole between, let's say, technology and history or humanism. No, a synthesis like depicting humanism like the MIT wanted, or also their curriculum of teaching architecture. The American dealing with this, they have other lines, other arguments, other narratives, like this one in Architectural Forum, which is very interesting, in which they are trying to, again, pair ideas and architects like Mies van der Rohe, the free plan, the universal space. This is from Champ. No, there are so many examples. This is Alvar Aalto, the dormitory in the MIT. So they are pairing all the time European buildings with American proposals of building, the way that they say, okay, this is valid. No, we are building upon European architecture, which has been tested out, has been tried out. It has a trajectory, it has a reputation, blah blah blah. No? And they are adding things like the functional tradition, no? These engineering civil works that they find very close to the functional issues that they want to rely on, because that's part of their DNA, no? That to rely on the industry. And they will be adding, like in this article by Douglas Haskell, the editor of Architectural Forum, again, this twist, no, as we saw before. So building upon the international style, the European modern architecture, all these things that we have seen through different arguments and narratives, they would say, let's add things related to the popular taste, being them, the Googie architecture, no, this architecture based on the aerospace aircrafts, airships, and the streamlining cars and transports, let's say, and also things related to the world of the marketing, the publicity, the advertising, all these things. Let's add this to the architecture the way that people can feel more close to architecture, and we become as a whole more successful. No, of course, at the end, there will always be, find you right, at the genius, the master of architecture in America, the truly American genius. No, well, the main issue that they are proposing is, of course, skyscrapers, how to deal with curtain wall, and so on. To wrap up this part and moving on to the second one, I don't know how we are doing. I would say that, of course, there is always this stress, this tension, this like this unbalanced dialogue between, even in the Swiss magazines, between tradition, vernacular architecture, the past and the future, the technology, the technique, the modern architecture, looking to something which is not the history. Baumeister and Balkons and Wellford in Germany, it happens the same. To discover gable roof versus this one of Mies van der Rohe with the flat roof, of course. So we always find these problems. So we don't know if we should look at the past or at the future. And then eventually we have this depicted by, let's say, Domus in Italy versus Casabella, the one of Gio Ponti and Ernesto Casson-Rogers, with Architectura of Bruno Sevi in the middle, like trying to look to both the past and the future in a way that can be a meeting point, let's say. In England, with the architectural review and architectural design, as we saw before, this is not happening at all in America. No, these four magazines, although these are commercial, let's say, Architectural Record Forum and Arts and Architecture, the small one from the West Coast, and Perspecta, the magazine of the University of Yale, they don't have these problems. They have a clear faith in the future, in the technology, and in the industry. So they don't have a problem with that. They can look at the past and use architectural elements in a way. Sometimes it will happen that they will use in a very naive way, and that will lead to postmodernism. But that's another story that we don't have time to look at. And this exhibition of Beatriz Colomina and her students and colleagues in Princeton, Flips and Fall, she was explaining how in the decade of the 60s and the 50s, there will be a blossoming of magazines, like hundreds of them, instead of the few ones that I have studied in the 50s that are sufficient to look at. And I would like to leave this image here because in the future we will see how much we can rely on this source as a primary source. And the question will be, has contemporary architecture changed compared to in the last 2 decades? Has it changed more than modern architecture changed compared to the 19th century and before? This would be a good question to answer later, and then I will be leaving it here. Moving on to contemporariness. No, I'm alone in 6, very quickly if I can, 6 groups, pairs of ideas that Juan Antonio Cortés is saying that can help us, and there are examples in which we can see that these are going to be or are going to help us to produce strong forms that are culturally meaningful for our collective society. You know, the first example is this the Tate Modern building in London, in the South Bank, the bank side, by Herzog and de Meuron. This is a very well-known building with the Millennium Bridge by Norman Foster. This is they say this is a hybrid between tradition, Art Deco, and super modernity. You know, it's a contemporary building that looks like a kind of a torch or a lantern at night, and can accommodate very easily these contemporary exhibitions and performances inside. Now it's a very flexible building, etc. But it is integrated, with by this simple gesture of accepting what's already given to us, this brick building by Sir Gilbert Scott, and adding a few things that are clearly different. So we are not mimicking, we are not using a technique of pastiche or collage, the same as David Chipperfield was doing in the Museum Island, not these images. Museum Island in Berlin, I brought this example, which is a different one, in which he is clearly setting an abstract, this is his intervention, an abstract language very strong, in which the new parts are clearly differentiated from the old ones here. But he's, let's say, posing a dialogue through an element that is convenient and is clearly identified in classical architecture, which is the porch. And if we look, or if you have visited the Acropolis in Athens, for me, this this image resembles clearly this one with the Doric Parthenon, and this idea of placing the buildings in an oblique angle, and not like in the Roman way of placing it in front of the root. And then this small Ionic Erecteion temple. For me, this is telling me things about the past and posing a conversation with the classical architecture and historical context in a way. And this image, the same. The caryatids here in the Erecteion temple. So there's different levels, etc. For me, these ideas, and for many people, I think that are an intelligent way of having a dialogue with the past without being naive or childish. This is another building by Emilio Tuñón, Spanish architect, El Gary Alvear Foundation or Museum, which is a very useful resource that he's using in other buildings. But even in the interior, we have, again, this kind of classical proportions and this reliance of the symbols of squares, the golden sections, things like that. This is Madrid. This is the Retiro Park, beautiful aerial image with the Retiro Park, the Castellana, the Royal Palace, the Cathedral, the Catedral de Almudena, and this building, which is the Royal Museum for the Royal Collection, in which Emilio Tuñón, with his unfortunately passed because he died, Luis Moreno Mansilla, they are placing again a dialogue in a very subtle, abstract, rational, intellectual way with our not so very fortunate cathedral, you know, and then creating this beautiful interior spaces in which the tapestry or these fabrics are going to be showcased in the future. Even in the domestic and in domestic buildings like this one, which is stone house, we see how again Emilio Tuñón is using these strategies that take us to Andrea Palladio, this a geometry of and this sequence of spaces and the use of geometry, the way that things look like a unitary form in which nothing can be add or remove without losing interest or without spoiling it, which lead us to the second strategy, which actually deals with this idea of the perfect Platonic form, which is not anymore a question that we are dealing with probably in the contemporariness. No? It can be, I mean, you can choose that, but actually the interests in the case of Earth on the Meuron are displaced to the possibility of having a unitary form, which is the form because we cannot capture it completely unless we go to this aerial view, which is artificial and it never happens, although you have a drone or you're in a helicopter or a chopper. Rather than that, the interest is in this beautiful, like undulating enclosure or scheme with this printed glass, probably that they have used before, as again as a ornamentation that emanates from the material itself, so not something that they are adding. It's part of the solution that they are choosing for the facade. And then they create these spatial sequences by setting back, no, by cutting the slabs. No, the gray areas are the slabs, and then these are the spaces that are void or empty. No, so creating this communication vertically. Actually, they say, or it is clear that there's a connection with the skyscrapers that Mies van der Rohe was drawing at the beginning of the 20th century, when he could not build anything. He was in Germany building for say rich people, but he was not building a skyscraper. Just drawing them with these charcoal drawings, the glass skyscraper, that probably would be later similar to some of the attempts buildings that he built in America. The interior of the library that Ernesto van der Meuron built is very joyful, colorful. It's completely crazy, interesting idea, right? That we are seeing here. This idea of unitary form with deformation is also present in this 21st Century Museum of Modern Art by Kazuyo Sejima and Ryo Nishizawa in Japan. And it happens the same, that the form, although it is a circumference, it cannot be perceived as whole except if you are on top of the building. So it never happens, or it's not important for them. For them, what's important is to create this non-hierarchical solution in which there's neither front nor back. No, there's nothing. There are entrances, and there's a kind of isotropic space inside in which you can move kind of freely in this very schematic or diagrammatic plan that they have placed. Also using the glass in a very contemporary but modern way, no, taking it very literally from the use of glass in the modern architecture as a boundary and as also as a probably a connection with surroundings, with the exterior, no, creating these beautiful spaces as usual in which they are masters. More forms that can be perceived as one single unity or entity are these two examples that we're going to see. The case of Rem Koolhaas or Office for Metropolitan Architecture. This is a very well-known library in Seattle, and it's I'm quoting them because Rem Koolhaas was answering to Sarah Whiteley in an interview, and he was saying that this was not a deconstructivist building anymore, because he said the essence of deconstructivism was not its estrangement of form, but its dismantling of fragmentation of the whole. These buildings, so Seattle and the next one, the Casa de Musica in Porto, Portugal, these buildings insist on integration and the act of joining the construction of a new whole, which may be turbulent, like this one, or unstable, yet is still a single entity, no? And that's why he's using the same strategy as we saw before in the case of the Ernesto van der Meuron library. So he's cutting or setting back the way that he's creating very interesting internal vertical connections, but actually there's one scheme, no, one material which is going around wrapping the building, although multifaceted with this lean inclined different planes, but it's one single thing. It has to be perceived. It must be perceived as one object, in which interior we have these 2 or 3 high stories with this interlocking floors that offers this, I think, amazing experience of reading and enjoying the library. In this building, which is an auditorium in Porto, Portugal, Casa da Musica, Eventually, what happens is that the shape is a volume that clearly encompasses the interior volumes, as we can see in the section, which is two main auditorium, one bigger and another one smaller. There is this, of course, as usual, this disdain, we will say, of what is the outcome, what is the form, and this very criticized, highly criticized dissolution and lack of interest in the context that, well, probably can be something that can be discussed. But of course, it's a unitary form in which the dialogue is set by opposition, no? By difference. The interiors are like this, more kind of technological, concrete, exposed concrete and aluminum. And then there are some, also another interior, not only the terrace, there is this twink to the Portuguese ceramic tiles industry. No? Another example of on the Merlon, in which they are using this strategy of having a direct translation of the traditional house, no? This archetypal, no? The way that a child would draw a house, because they are saying that since they are displaying furniture and household objects, it's a connection that it is of their interest, no? But actually, the interior is really complex because they are stacking the buildings in different ways and creating, again, this vertical connection that we have seen before in the library and in other buildings by OMA. The third approach to create strong forms, in the words of Juan Antonio Cortés that I'm bringing, is the fact that we are now, if we think about the domino structure of Le Corbusier, one of the key things was that we are separating the structure of the facade, of the envelope, let's say. And in this case, it's saying, now we are building strong forms by having the same structure as enclosure. No? So in the case of this stadium in Braga, in Portugal, by Eduardo Souto de Moura, this is what he's doing. And if you look at the section with this like a kind of hill or mountain, we see that this is taking us to brutalism, for example, no? Clearly to me, in which we are showing the material as it is. It is completely naked, exposed. I don't know if you can see the beton brut of the brutalism in these slabs, and no, there is nothing attached, no painting, no plastering, nothing. It's just the structure as it is, and this is the building. So structure and enclosure together. This is probably a very well-known building, the Mediatek in Sendai, that was destroyed in this tsunami or earthquake some time ago and then rebuilt. Toyo Ito was proposing a very transparent building in which he was reflecting on many things of modern architecture. Of course, again, the domino structure, the free plan of Le Corbusier, the open space of Mies van der Rohe, and I would say also the server spaces, no? This reflection of Louis Kahn, in which he was proposing, like, let's pay attention to both server and servant spaces. They have a meaning. And in the case of Toyo Ito, he is actually using these hollow vertical connections to accommodate installations. They are also vertical connections, communications, and the structure of the building. Like somehow in this proposal, no? In this model of the 50s by Louis Kahn and his collaborator and team for Philadelphia Tower. These are some images in which we see again the ideas of transparency, the use of glass to support this idea of the dissolution of the building, of a very light building, resembling probably also the ideas of Mies van der Rohe in the 50s. Then the fourth group, or the fourth pair, will be continuity and differential variation, in which a very good example is this competition that Alejandro Saera and Farshid Musavi won at the verge of the end of the 20th century. Of course, the idea was probably that this mediating device between the public spaces of Yokohama and the management of cruise passengers, which is the terminal itself, was more like a continuous fluid material, probably I would say meant to be built with concrete, because it's the most plastic element that we can have, the material that we can use. But actually it has its limitations, not only the expansion joints, but also the formwork itself, the molds that we use to put the concrete. So they are limited, the spans that it can be covered. So eventually they change this continuous fluid form, and they accepted they have to build it with many sections, actually small variations of the same section throughout, longitudinal, transversal sections of this longitudinal building, which is the terminal itself. Finally, the result is okay. It's fluid, and the flow of passengers and the folding, of the slabs works fine, but it is some continuous space that it's built through small, slight differential variations. The last building that I think that can accommodate or can simplify the idea of continuities through differential variation is this one, which is again reflecting on the idea of the dominant structure. But in this case, these two slabs are not parallel. No, they are. They have a slight very subtle curvature, and they, the architects are posing or trying to incorporate natural light through these cordials, through kind of excavating and removing part of this roof. I think that it's a very advanced solution that starts with the domino structure of Le Corbusier. And what they were doing is, of course, in a place or a building which is a learning center, they were trying to emphasize communication and flow of ideas, sharing of ideas, and minimize visual barriers with the use of glass, and minimizing the barriers also for movement, and aiming for transparency and openness, of course, that they, again, achieve very clearly. The fifth group, I'm moving very quickly to these two last ones, will be how another concept of Le Corbusier, the architectural promenade, is to be found in the Netherlands Embassy in Berlin by, again, Rem Koolhaas. This idea of how we experience the building by moving into it through a route that can be more or less meandering. And actually, it's also connected with the idea of round plan, these interlocking rooms that Adolf Loos, the beginning of the 20th century, another master of modern architecture, posed with so many buildings, for instance, Hara House, the villa, some of the villas at the beginning, Stein House, and others. This is the, let's say, like the roots inside the building, and some of the interiors. Another nice example of how roots can also be posing a strong form inside a complex geometry. This is one of Mercedes-Benz building in Stuttgart in Germany by Ben van Berkel and Caroline Bosch in studio. This is a building that actually is, the idea is that the visitor goes in the building and then goes up in elevator or lifts to the upper part, and then he can go down through the ramps, like in the case of course, the Frankie Wright's Guggenheim Museum in New York. These ramps, Guggenheim Museum, and this is, of course, a contemporary building that we are talking about. Finally, very quickly, but I think this is 50 minutes already. How light, color, transparency, and reflections. In the case of this building by Luis Moreno Mancilla, again, the Museum of Contemporary Art in León, this kind of unfolded grid, this warped grid that creates this web of squares and diamonds, propose an autonomous concatenated grid of rooms, very flexible, continuous, but they offer at the same time a very nice, like a public space to the city with this facade in which they are placing a dialogue, an intellectual dialogue with things that people who live there know, with the colored glass of the Cathedral of León, something that inspired a lot of architectures in different places, but with the flexibility and well-lit spaces through kind of this clear story separation between the structure of the building and the roof, with this again very flexible spaces. An idea, you see, this open plan opposed to the closed building that is this stadium, also opposed to the one that we saw in Praga by Eduardo Soto de Moura. This is Herzog and de Meuron, again in Munich, and they are using this very technological, sophisticated facade with this material, which is ethyl tetrafluoroethylene, ETFE. These pillows that actually can change the color depending on the team they are hosting for the night. I don't know the names because I'm not fan of football, but I think it's Bayern Munich and probably. So, but then no, this is how they are working, depicting the idea of a very strong form that actually can be soft and can be also talking with the context and with the audience in a larger extent. I think this is one of the last two buildings that I have, Stephen Hall, one of the masters of light. In this case, he's using the glass. First, he's posing the dialogue again with an historical building, but he's using the glass, the way that it's more an element which is light and transparent, but it's solid. No? We see here that this is like the glass becoming a translucent, actually probably it's glass, it's not glass, it's the material he's using. So he's placing a dialogue with the context by giving some consistency to the building, to making it not really light, but actually heavy, the opposite, although he's using very light materials. Finally, another building by Kazuyo Sekima and Ryo Nishizawa in the use of light and not color, transparency in this case. This is the glass pavilion at the Toledo Art Museum, in which they are using a very schematic diagrammatic plan, this regular grid of rectangular modules in which they are using very soft curves for the corners, and they are doubling in some cases the walls that they will have different degrees of transparency and translucent, even reflections of lights. So different atmospheric, I would say, effects. Maybe linking this with the phenomenology, if you want, with work of Peter Zumthor, maybe another architects, even Stephen Hall. But also, using the glass in a very contemporary way that probably we haven't seen before in modern architecture. These 6 pairs of ideas, I will translate them as integrations through differentiation, unitary form, although the form, structure as enclosure, continuity upon differential variation, and then food and scape and light and color. I will not touch them. What I want to, again, is wrapping up. So how much architecture has changed, no matter how many different type of software we are using. I don't want to make a naive or superficial discourse to finish the lecture. I don't want to say that we don't have evolved or we haven't added new ideas like sustainability or gender, if you want, or technology, materials, high technology, etc. To the architectural agenda. Of course, we have done that, but it is true that, like William Curtis is here. This building of the 50s was inspiring externally Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum, or probably also the Walt Disney Auditorium, but also here the interior of some of the Tadao churches. Why not? We can also compare how we are using now ornamentation, if we want to look at brutalism, and then the work of here Marcel Breuer, but also if we look at the brutalist work of Paul Rudolph, we will find resemblance in how Erzon and de Meuron are using the texture of the material as ornamentation, not decoration anymore, and how we are relying on the texture and the, let's say, the enclosure as, as our, if we want to call it, decoration of our times. Sometimes we don't even know which buildings belong to the contemporariness and to the past if we don't use like black and white images, no? And then it's difficult to know which of them, I will not ask you, maybe later, which of these buildings are some of the buildings that I have mentioned in the lecture, and which of these buildings are to be built, and they are very similar in a way, similar to Mies van der Rohe, and even using domestic spaces like this one that one very well-known architect in Spain is posing now. What we have done with skyscrapers, if we are relying on pure form, like in the Seagrams building by Mies van der Rohe, in which he doesn't want to have a setback, like other buildings in New York. He doesn't want to stick to the zoning, and he prefers to build the perfect parallelepiped. So what are we doing? No, are we still thinking about this beauty of forms, or we are more into a more technological surface, which actually is talking to the environment in a more sustainable way, and we are caring about that in this thing, in the case of the new building in Madrid. How we are using classical architectural elements like the dome in the case of the Reichstag building by Norman Foster in Germany. And finally, just to finish, because this is almost 1 hour, if we look at the Eros Arinens terminal for the John Fitzgerald Kennedy in the airport in New York, and this new building, very recently finished by Zaha Hadid and Patrick Schumacher in Beijing, I think it's a matter of scale. But if we look at the interior spaces, again, this is a matter of scale or probably spans, if you want. But the spaces are very similar. No, I don't think that we have gone too far in that sense. For my side, I think this is more than enough. I'm sorry if it took so long. I hope it's been of your interest, and I would really be very happy if you have some questions that we can have a conversation now. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Doctor. We already notified our audience if they can send their questions now. You can keep the screen if you like.
Okay, so
we have the first question from Rand. How do you anticipate COVID would affect future architecture?
Well, this is sure a great question. I'm probably not touching it because in my lecture, I think it will, and it is already affecting. No, I think that it is going to the things that modern architecture did for us. One of the achievements or the things that modern architecture help us is to survive or to eradicate tuberculosis in a way. There are buildings like the Pamio Sanatorium of Alvar Alto, which is dealing with that. But more than that is how we have ventilated the spaces and well lit with natural light spaces, the way that the air circulates and the viruses don't remain in the space. It's something from the modern movement from the 20s or even before. So that helps in that sense. I think that we haven't learned that much because, for example, my office has no windows, believe it or not. And then this is something that we are teaching our students at offices and workspaces. They need to be ventilated and they need natural light. So I think that we will insist more in that because COVID is asking us to move in that direction, that have spaces in which we can interact without risks. So more flexible spaces, open spaces, less partitions, less walls, more windows that we can actually open and close instead of just this sophisticated curtain glass walls that we have in skyscrapers, etc. I would say that probably this will be some of the ideas that people who are designing workspaces or spaces for us in the future will be dealing with.
Yeah, we have another question from Reem. Can I define contemporary architecture as a new architecture / modern with the value of traditional elements to create elements inspired from traditional elements of the country which the project built in?
Well, a definition of contemporary architecture, I would say, Reem, thank you for the question. It will be probably contemporary architecture is for sure, from an historical point of view, it's what's happening now, what's happening in this, let's say, 10 years to now. But if the question is probably what's contemporary architecture, what's meaningful or contemporary architecture that has cultural value or interest for us, I would add for sure, like you are saying in your question, that is connected to, if not vernacular architecture, that has probably resemblance or an interpretation, or has taken what's relevant from vernacular traditional architectural or history as a whole. And it's not neglecting it because it's just using, let's say, digital tools or starting from a blank page, which will be really sad. No, we are doing that even in the contemporariness. That's fine. That's
Yeah.
really what I would say.
We have a question from Dr. Javier saying architecture is moving between being rational, modern to emotional, pomo, and deconstruction. Do you think that the future is for the rational architecture again?
Well, I do believe, that yes, and it's an interesting question also for architectural students. What, what, how are you going to be designing? What are you going to be relying on? I'm sure, and I can infer from the question of the doctor. Thank you for the question, by the way. That it's going to be deconstructivism for sure. No, and this is a chapter which, like I said at the beginning, probably is already closed. Closed. We have to accept it. It was interesting at some point. I think probably like postmodernism, to some extent, it was mistaken in many ways or misunderstood by people, even for these connections of Derrida and Brutalism, and some of them are very interesting intellectual, solipsistic examples of architecture or attempts, but I don't think that we can really move forward if we rely on deconstructivism. But for sure, modern architecture and rational architecture, they are part of our DNA, of our architectural agenda, of our contemporary agenda. There are our roots. No, they are not just trends or episodes like I would say postmodernism or deconstructivism are, but part of what we are dealing with. No, contemporary architecture is moving from modern architecture, and rationalism, of course, is part of it. No, so we say that the question I well placed, and I stick to it. No, this is what's going to happen. This is my belief.
We have a question from Fernando. He's saying over the past centuries, we can, or specific, we can find relationship between art, painting, and sculpture and architecture. Do you find any relationship between other arts disciplines and architecture over the past 20 years?
Hola, Fernando, and thank you for the question. Gracias. I think that, well, of course, this is the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, no? The total work of art, no? The integration of arts that comes from the opera, from Richard Wagner. And we have tried it out in architecture at the beginning of the 20th century. I am not 100% sure if this is possible in the contemporariness. I'm not sure. Because if we look at Arne Jacobsen or architects of the first half of the 20th century, and this idea of a designer who is designing from the handle, no, to the city in a building, even the cutlery and the linen for the tables. I think this is something not very contemporary. I think, because we rely a lot in catalogs and mass production of industry. So I find it hard. Nonetheless, I could say that it's very interesting if we can integrate, in that sense, other arts in our architecture, either throughout the discourse of the discipline or through particular examples. But I don't think that we can go back in that direction to to make these different arts meet in something that actually makes sense as a whole. I find it difficult, but I think that probably some people can give it a try. I find it hard to do, in my opinion.
So we still have more 2 questions and we can wrap up. This is from Rahaf. Any book advice for history and contemporary of architecture?
Yes, Rahat, thank you. Well, I don't know. Can I see myself? Maybe I'm seeing myself. If I can see the camera.
You can see it.
I
I
know,
can.
but I'm just
Oh, okay.
find
The
where I am.
PowerPoint.
Okay, so I'm here. Then I see. So you see the PowerPoint, or you see me? If I show you
The
these books
PowerPoint, and we can see you. Ah, yeah. If you want, I will stop
and
your.
books,
Yeah, I will stop it.
this one,
Yes.
I think this is a great book. Yeah, Louis Kahn, one of the recent histories of architecture. This is a very interesting one. I heard that the Sir Vanistone Fletcher, I think it's going to be published again or republished. I also think that, well, this book of theory, maybe this one is more advanced, no, but history of architecture, I would recommend for sure, 100%. The future of architecture since 1889. Louis Kahn is still alive, so he's still writing. Probably, this is a Spanish, but it's space-time architecture and a very canonical history of architecture of Siegfried Gideon. It's good, but it's like a history of masters and epigones. Probably not that. Yeah. I don't have more books here. That one, Louis Cohen, I would say. Ragat. How are you, Ragat?
So another question from Tasneem is, what do you think the biggest challenge architecture is facing now?
Well, Tasneem, thank you. Hello. Many challenges. One, I think, and I would like to, I don't want to take your time. I'm really happy to answer many questions, so I will extend a bit more.
Actually, that was the last question, but we have two raised hands, so we can wrap up with them, with Loy and also Dr. Filwen.
Okay, I will keep it shorter than the way we
no
have
worries.
time for. I
Take
think,
your
yeah,
time.
there are many challenges. I think that one, and that's what I wanted to, is that we have displaced the discourse of the discipline. They were at some point, star architects were really relevant, and they were avant-garde in many ways. And now they are completely evil and demon, no? This is one thing that we still have to rethink. I think that we have to look back to that and see if the progress of architecture can be done without, let's say, taking into account these star architects. That's why in a way, I brought these architects back, because I think that they are still meaningful. This is the truth. The challenges are that we don't become irrelevant, that our role as architects, as the guys who are capable of having a holistic approach to the act of building, becomes less relevant or more and more irrelevant, because engineers are taking pieces, like they are removing parts of this and then making our role smaller as time passes. At the end, we are just designers, which is sad. No, we should be having a more important role. My friend Manuel Saga from Torino is telling me that yes, the 21st edition of Sir Bannister Fletcher. You're seeing that this is for Ragat. In the chat, you have a very good.
We started having more questions, so you need to be patient with us. We can take some questions.
I'm very happy. I'm just
no,
I don't want to take time from people who are not, but I'm really.
That's okay. So this is a question from part of the box that you recommended, but I will leave that book question the last, so we can have other questions from Taqwa. Do you think the reason why there has been no additional style relative to architecture is that because of the investment in smart architecture recently, for example?
Sorry, can you repeat? There hasn't been more addition to?
This is Taqwa. Do you think the reason why there has been no new additional style additive to architecture
the additional style?
Yes.
Is it because of the lack of investment?
No, she's wondering if that's because of the investment in smart cities, for instance.
Well, I think that styles, from a historical point of view, well, I look at magazines, in my PhD, but I think that styles, they need some time, that we can tag them and we can identify them more than just a trend. I would say that, of course, you're right saying that one style or one trend becoming a style is a sustainable architecture, but also because it's one of our our agenda, our contemporary agenda, is dealing with that. No, it's one of our priorities. So it's not only a style; it's our goal, no, to achieve a truly sustainable architecture that is dealing with the environment in a nicer way than now. If because of that, eventually it happens that you can or we can name something as a style, then okay. But I think that probably it happens like band rocks, that the architects, they don't want to be tagged, or they don't want to be framed as stylistic or formalistic. They don't want to say, you are doing this, you are doing that. No, they want to be more kind of a critical, a serial, I would say. They have interest, but they don't have a defined style like before, no? Like, I don't know, you look at the building of Richard Mayer or Santiago Calatrava, or even Hungary. I mean, you know, this is a Gehry, this is a Zaha. I think that most architects, I would say, they don't want to be tagged or framed or, you know, like put in a box. They cannot move freely in different directions.
We have a voice question from Loai.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm asking him to unmute. Yes.
Yes, hi. My question is regarding terminology with the term modern architecture that you have used many times in your presentation. So did you refer to architecture up to date, or maybe modern architecture belongs to a specific period, or maybe it refer to modernism?
Yeah, well, this is thank you, Roy, for the question. It is true that if like me, you're teaching history of architecture, modern architecture is not what's happening today. No, we know, and this is a misunderstanding that we clarified the first day in theory and history of architecture. Modern architecture refers to architecture, if we want, to the second and third decade of Europe, but to some extent to the first half of the 20th century. That's why we can call that there was a crisis of modern architecture in the 50s, no, after World War II. Another thing would be contemporary architecture. This misunderstanding of international style that I try to clarify is because actually the architecture of the modern movement in Europe became international style in America through this exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art, and then became, and actually is, the standard in places like the one that I am, in Saudi Arabia, and to some extent in some places of the Middle East, in which some people believe that modern architecture is what's happening now, and the rest is classical or historical architecture, no? And then buildings or villas are built as classical if they have volutes or pilaster or a pitched roof, if you want, and modern buildings or houses are flat roofs and horizontal or big windows, if you want, no decoration, smooth, soft, white or beige facades. No? This is a misunderstanding. In history, of course, we know that modern architecture is one thing, contemporary architecture is what's happening now, and modern movement, it's something that happened in Europe. You know? If this is the what do you understand too? This is what I understand and what books. Although with these precisions that I did of certain authors that were not interested at all in separating or being very accurate with what's modern architecture, was avant-garde, what this, what that, no?
So modern architecture refers to modernism.
Yeah, I would say so, modernism, yes, of course.
And when we say modern movements, it
modern
can
movement,
refer to any movement.
no, modern movement, it's something shorter. The modern movement is kind of the from the beginning of the 20th century to 1932, maybe, no, to the exhibition of the Museum of Modern Art. This will be the modern movement, which is again something that happened in Europe, and then the translation of that through the exhibition of the Museum of Modern Art is the international style, and then altogether it becomes the first half of the century modern architecture, if you want to call it. No?
Okay, and what is left from modernism in our architecture now?
Yeah, I think at a lot of things, no? That's why the lecture was trying to like sort of connect, bridge this gap. Say that postmodernism and deconstructivism, even high tech, are episodes that are part of modern architecture with these diversions, if you want. But the agenda of modern architecture is still part of the agenda with other issues, of course, sustainability, gender, equity, all the things that you want to say, diversity, many things. But I think that that's why I put together the dominant structure, the free plan, the open space, the free section. I think it's not something that we were dealing in modern architecture, but now in the contemporariness, or at least in the last 2 decades, or last decade of the 21st century, but also the ground plan of how of lost present. So many things, I would say, the idea of how to use not decoration, but the honesty of materials, how now we can show the structure of buildings and we are not ashamed of, and through brutalism, so we can see a building as it is without adding or decorating, hiding things. The idea of server and servant spaces of Louis Kahn, the installations can be shown. It's not something that we have to hide and like wrapped. And these things are present in contemporariness, I think, although they can be mere textual devices, let's say.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rai, for your question. That's great talking to you.
So last 2 questions, one from, I think, Pietres, if I'm not spelling it wrong. It can be inferred from what was exposed during the lecture that there is a continuity in what it was described as strong forms and the principles of modernity in that sense. Do you think that the weak forms would be the ones that are kind of denying them or going against them? You mentioned the mistake, and it was the postmodernity could this weak forms most likely being produced digitally. In your opinion, what is your opinion about it?
Yeah, I think that, like I said, the first part of the lecture is my research on the 50s and the crisis of modern architecture. The second one is something I'm taking from Juan Antonio Cortés. And these 2 texts, but I kind of stick to that. It was a provocative, I hope, discourse. But I think that what he's saying is actually that, is one of the conclusions of the second text, strong forms, is that parametricism, rhino and grasshoppers, which was a tool that actually, I think it was Cecil Valmont was starting to use, a tool to help geometry to design more efficient structures. So we have taken this tool as something meaningful, as part of what's taking it as the process to make something, and the outcome of that is valid. There's a certain autonomy embedded in the process, which, in the words of Juan Antonio Cortés, and I would stick to that, is wrong, because it's, what is produced in a critical way with this software, it's not valid per se. It has to be filtered, distilled, and then adapted, if you want, to the context and to the, and then also because we as architects have this role, it cannot be left to the computer. Actually, because what he says is that parametric software cannot decide what parameters are key or are important. We have to do that. So since this cannot be done, then everything has to be, let's say, manipulated and done by us and not let the software is set. More than that, what he's saying that these weak forms don't have a cultural value because they are just the outcome of software. So they are meaningless. These things that, these blobs and these very soft, weak, like bubble kind of surfaces, they are not, again, per se, culturally adding anything to the discourse. They are really autonomous and kind of isolated as forms, and they are not kind of building up on the historical discourse, which is a continuum, I would say. So this is.
So last question is from Sita. She raised her hand long time, but we kept her to the last, so we can wrap up.
Yeah.
Hello, doctor. How are you?
Hi, Sita. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Doctor, I just wanted to ask you, I really liked the presentation. It was really interesting and I learned a lot, but I wanted to ask if you recommend any architecture like books to read for like students and stuff.
Yeah, I think there are many, and my recommendation would be go to the library and grab as many books as you can. I can tell you that histories of architecture are really useful. They cover at least the 20th century. You started before, well, that's okay, but for a student, architectural engineering student, 20th century would be enough. And then also, well, it's not because I'm Spanish, but I think that some collections like El Croquis, these monographies of architects, they have a lot of value, not because I'm saying, it's because everybody knows in the field, let's say that they are really valuable. So there are many books and also small monographies, short books on Le Corbusier, the Amir van der Rohe, Frank Gehry, all the masters of modern architecture that you can easily buy and grab from the library and start looking at them. But since you're my student, we can talk about that soon. So thank you for the question, Sida. Beatriz, I didn't say hello to you on the kids. Hello, how are you? How are you?
So thank you, Doctor. And I think we can wrap up now.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions and for being here until this late. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed, to the audience.
Thank you, everyone.
To follow this.
Thank you too also, and looking to see you again. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.